This is chapter 12, part 3. Let's continue on going over some basic recent stats on LSD. So we talked about how the levels were high in the 70s, came down some in the 80s. We get a jump back up in the 90s, but nowadays near record lows. Okay, now this 90s jump that we saw, the increase in the 90s, the subsequent increase in its use during the mid-1990s may reflect the effects of what's called, there's a term you should be familiar with, generational forgetting. That is, what we mean by generational forgetting is the replacement cohorts, the kids who are growing up and coming later than those who were, say teenagers, young adults in the 80s, the ones who came of age in the 90s, they didn't really know so much about the dangers of LSD. They were kind of naive because they were coming up in a later cohort, a later generation. And so they were sort of naive about the potential dangers of LSD because they didn't have so much experience with it, or they didn't see people around them having bad experiences, having bad highs, a bad trip, and stuff that's kind of scary. And so since they didn't see and experience or hear too much about the negative stuff, then they were willing, again, this was perceived not dangerous, and so they're willing to try it. And you see that with a lot of different kinds of drugs, that people are more willing to try it when it's new, and you haven't seen the negative consequences of the drug. You haven't had negative experiences. And so that's what you often see in the beginning. A lot of people try it. Negatives follow afterwards, addiction follows afterwards, and then so the numbers drop. But then maybe in the next generation, the numbers might come up again. So you get kind of waves of up and down over the generations. The decline in use prior to 2002 might have resulted in part from a displacement of LSD by sharply rising use of MDMA, ecstasy, and more recently Molly, drugs that I won't have time to talk about in this chapter, but you should take a look at them in the chapter. So that's another thing, a phenomenon that you see that I don't know if the textbook talks about it, which is not only the sort of wave effect that I just mentioned about drug use, that it kind of goes in and out of fashion based on its perceived dangerousness and the experiences that people are having with it. So you get waves, but you also get waves because of new drugs come along and they're exciting, and so people will switch to new drugs and use the old drugs less. So you get sort of the fashion element of it. Things go in waves in terms of what people are into. So people get burned out on one type of drug, and so they switch over to another one because they're having more positive experiences with the new drug. So just think of, for different reasons, these different reasons that I've outlined, you have a wave-like effect. You tend to get up and down over time for these different reasons. So that the textbook doesn't really stress that, but that's an important phenomenon that you tend to see with drugs, different types of drugs. Okay, so after 2001, when MDMA use itself began to decline, the further decline in LSD use likely resulted from a sudden drop in the availability of LSD. Again, another thing that decreases use is if it's harder to get, because attitudes generally have not moved in a way that could explain the fall in use, while perceived availability has. Okay, so what's the research telling us? It's telling us people are using less, number one. Number two, they don't, if you ask them on surveys about how dangerous is LSD, they're not really saying that they think it's that dangerous, but they're saying that it's harder to get. It's less available. So the availability, the reduced availability, may be an important reason why people are not using LSD much. Availability is one of those factors that do indeed seem to matter according to the research. Okay, what do we got here? I got another graph that gets at the numbers of perceived availability, asking seniors in high school, all the way going back to 1975 up to 2022, how easy is it to get LSD? Now, at the bottom of the graph is 1975. So the first few bars there on the bottom are going to be the old years. So here's 1975, and it looks like it keeps slipping away from me here. 1975 at the bottom, and then and you can see, compared to the rest of the graph, that's a high level of availability. It's probably hard for you to read, but I'm seeing about roughly 46% of the people taking the survey say it's fairly easy or very easy to get LSD. That was the attitude back in 1975. You can see in the 80s, the next 1-2 bars up from the bottom, you can see that fewer young people, fewer seniors in high school, only 30% or 35% was saying that it's available. That number grows in the 90s, peaks in 1995, when we saw, roughly speaking, that use of LSD peaks. So you had over 50% of these seniors, high school seniors, saying, yeah, it's available, over half. And it's not a coincidence that in that mid-90s is when you had the highest percentage of people who were trying LSD. If it's more available, more people try it. That's a, kind of a rule of thumb with drugs. And then you can see after that peak in the mid-90s, by 2000, it's dropped some, and there's basically a gradual decline up into the early 2000s, 2005. It's basically plateaus after that, where you've got about 25 or 30%, somewhere in there, the mid-20s, who say it's available. So that's lower than the 90s, lower than 1975. It's more like the 80s. And you can see in the last couple of, or I shouldn't say last couple, but recent years, even lower, down into the under 25% say it's available. So that's the story there, is that why have people not been using it much in recent years? Well, most people say it's not around much. So it's not around much, fewer people use it. So there's data to back up the conclusions that we were making earlier. It should be noted that today's LSD users are different from those of a previous generation in a number of ways. Let's talk about those. The typical LSD users now take the drug less frequently, and because the dosage of street LSD is presently about 1/4 the level common to the 1960s or 70s, they may remain high for a briefer period of time. So this is actually a contrary trend to what I've told you folks before, which is as the years have gone by, the drugs have tended to get more concentrated, more powerful, delivering greater, more intense highs. This LSD is an exception to this general trend, because it's actually the typical experience with LSD now is a weaker one, with a weaker dosage of LSD than all those people who were experimenting with this new LSD in the 1960s. I mean, a lot of college students, a lot of the people who, referred to as hippies, or people who were into fashionable things that were going on, fashionable cultural things in the 60s, were experimenting with this drug, and into the 70s as well. But it's sort of an exception to the rule, that the drug was more powerful then than it is now. And it's a different sort of user in terms of the type of person who's taking it now. The motivation behind taking LSD is different now than it was, say, back in the 60s or 70s. People say now, if they're asked, well, why are you using LSD? What's your motivation? They'll say, well, I just enjoy the high, just to get high, because I want the experience of being high. That's a lot different answer than what a lot of people were giving back in the 60s, where they were talking, it was much more of an experience that was tied to creativity, or even, a sense of people exploring spiritually or opening up their minds to different levels of consciousness. So it had more of a, you know, uh, not it was something, not just getting high, but sort of almost a philosophical sort of thing, or trying to get greater insights into life. So it had sort of spiritual overtones, or at least mind expanding overtones. So that's a different sort of way of approaching this drug than just people who want to get high and have fun, right? It's different than just having fun. Um, you're not doing it just for the excitement of it. It's that back then they were thinking it was opening up unexplored domains. So for current users, LSD no longer has the symbolic or countercultural significance that it had in an earlier time. And by counterculture, we're talking about these folks who were taking drugs in the 60s. That was going against the mainstream culture, which did not like drugs and disapproved of these sorts of types of drug experimentation. And so it was a sort of rebellious, that's what we mean by counterculture, as it was rebellious, going against mainstream society at the time. Now, certainly drugs now have that rebellious aspect to them, but it has a different kind of a feel. Some of it has to do with a lot of these people involved in the 60s were kind of highly educated people, as opposed to now folks who are using could be of whatever level of education, not necessarily highly educated. Um, there are very few regular LSD abusers who have not experienced a bad trip or had a disturbing experience as part of an LSD trip. So that's one thing we can say, is that if you've used this regularly, you've probably had some bad experiences. The best treatment for adverse effects is the companionship and reassurance of others throughout the period when LSD is active. So again, the group, the social aspect of the drug, of this particular drug, seems to be particularly important. And if you're in a safe, supportive environment, you tend to have a more positive experience. There's no strong evidence that the panic that you could have during an LSD high will lead to a permanent psychiatric breakdown. No evidence. Some of these things the research addresses some attitudes that people have towards drugs, about whether does this seem to be the fact, or just kind of a rumor or a belief that's not actually backed up by evidence. Long-term psychiatric problems are relatively uncommon with LSD. One study conducted in 1960, so that's a long time ago, showed that there was no greater probability of a person attempting suicide or developing a psychosis, meaning losing touch with reality, after taking LSD than one undergoing ordinary forms of psychotherapy. So what the authors are getting at is that this drug isn't something that results in some sort of permanent psychiatric disorder, although you can have negative experiences. They're saying it's not really the type of drug that's going to translate into a mental illness. The incidents that do occur typically involve people who were unaware that they were taking LSD, so somebody slipped it to them. That they didn't, so they unknowingly took it, and they showed unstable, or other people who have had negative experiences, they tend to have more unstable personality characteristics, or the sort of people who are not going to do well with this kind of a drug, or were experiencing LSD under hostile or threatening circumstances. Again, these circumstances are very important, and if they're negative, hostile, threatening, you're more likely to have a negative experience. The possible link between the character of LSD effects and certain symptoms of schizophrenia has also been examined closely. It is true that on a superficial level, the two behaviors show some similarities, but there are important differences between schizophrenia, the symptoms of schizophrenia, and LSD. LSD hallucinations are primarily visual, so you're seeing distortions of things is what you actually are likely to see. They're best seen in the dark and are more accurately characterized as illusions or pseudo-hallucinations, because it's kind of like a bending, a distorting of images, And that sort of, it's more likely to be that. Whereas hallucination of schizophrenics, they're primarily, you hear voices, you hear things that aren't there. You're somebody giving you messages, telling you things, and then people aren't actually really there. And they're often seen with wide open eyes, not in the dark with your eyes closed. There's these schizophrenic hallucinations often happen with eyes open, and these type qualify as true hallucinations. You're seeing and hearing things that in no way are connected to reality, whereas the person on LSD might have distorted versions of things or seeing things with their eyes closed, so the mind is creating certain images. Individuals taking LSD are highly susceptible to suggestion and usually try to communicate the experience to others, whereas the schizophrenic individual typically is resistant to suggestion and is withdrawn from his or her surroundings. So the textbook here is laying out important differences between schizophrenic symptoms and LSD experiences. Therefore, it is unlikely that LSD is mimicking the experience of schizophrenia. There's too many differences there for it to be a mimicking. The unusual visual effects of an LSD experience may lead you to assume that your creativity is enhanced, but the evidence indicates otherwise. Professional artists and musicians creating new works of art or songs while under the influence of LSD typically think that their creations are better than anything they have yet produced. But when the LSD has worn off, they are far less impressed. So again, when you're high, you think what you're experiencing or what you're coming up with is particularly creative. But then when you see that your artistic creations back as a sober person, you can see that you were really under the influence of a drug and were very impressed by things that are not that impressive. Controlled studies generally show that individuals under LSD feel that they are creative, but objective ratings by other people rating the creative products do not show a significant difference from levels prior to the LSD. So how do we say that in plain English? The evidence from controlled studies, experimental studies, various types of studies indicates that LSD is not generating extra creativity. One of the most disturbing aspects of taking LSD is the possibility of re-experiencing the effects of the drug long after the drug was worn off, sometimes as long as several years later. These experiences are referred to as hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or much more simply, I prefer, flashbacks, which is what the public would be familiar with that term. Some studies estimate its rate of incidence as only 5% of people having a flashback if they've tried acid, whereas others estimate it as high as 33%. So it might depend on the dosage. Maybe if you had a higher dosage when you've tried it, more likely to have a flashback. Less so if your experience, your dosage was weaker, your experience is weaker. Flashback effects sometimes can be frightening and other times can be quite pleasant. They can occur among LSD novices, basically newbies, people just trying it out, or once-only drug users, drug takers, as well as among experienced LSD abusers. They can appear without warning, but there is a higher probability that they will occur when the individual is beginning to go to sleep, number one, or just entered a dark environment. So there's a couple circumstances where the flashback is more likely to be initiated. Whether LSD produces major long-term deficits in behavior remains largely unknown. So we have to be humble about some of these things because we haven't done enough research on them. Memory problems and visuospatial impairments have been reported in some studies, but not confirmed in others. So a lot still not known. We really should know a lot more about this drug than we do. It has been around and been used for quite a long time. So will LSD, I should say, increase? I've got a typo there. Will it increase violent behaviors? I'll have to fix that. Does it increase violence, or criminal behavior, which is the number one question for us in this course? It is true that an individual can freak out on LSD. People do have bad trips. That does happen. And we do know from research in general that if people if their brains are functioning in a way where they're malfunctioning, uh, and not working properly, that makes it difficult for a person to kind of control their behavior. So you sometimes can get violence if people's brains are not performing, are not functioning well. But, possibly you could have a violent episode, but a lot of times you would have something that would fall short of a violent episode. But the effects of a euphoriant drug, such as LSD, can lead to a feeling of vulnerability. And what we mean by that, when you're invulnerable, it feels like nothing could stop you, nothing could hurt you. You're like Superman, right? And somebody in that state can be risky, that can be a hazardous situation, because one of the things that helps us behave ourselves is the fear that we could be hurt if we act inappropriately, if we act violently. Well, that violence might be returned and we could be hurt or killed ourselves. So maybe we need to think twice about acting violently. But if you think you're Superman, then you're going to be less hesitant to strike out at somebody that you're angry with. This feeling in turn can lead to dangerous and possibly life-threatening behavior. So I think there's at least a pause, or we should sort of take a cautionary approach, thinking that it's possible that, and one possible negative consequence of the use of LSD is potential for erratic, irrational, and even possibly violent behavior. We should recognize that psychological reactions to LSD are inherently unpredictable, and caution is advised. So I think that would be one thing. If we're coming down on the behavioral aspects of this, it would not be, there's concern here with this drug. It's a very powerful one. And there we've completed our coverage of the basics of LSD. Again, let me remind you to take a look at other sections of the chapter and at least try to get big picture on the other major types of drugs.